Alright guys, today we're going to go over the AK and the AR. Why am I going over this? Well, when we start talking about preparedness and everything else that goes into it, obviously one of the things that everybody starts talking about is firearms. So I figured there's a lot of debate either way. I've used both pretty extensively. I focused a lot of time on AKs. I've used ARs a lot too. So I'll give you a quick rundown on why you might want to pick one versus the other. Spoiler alert, having both is going to be necessary if you want an AK. If you want an AR, you're good with just an AR. And I'll get into why. So don't get me wrong, I love AK still. So what we can do is start with the physical characteristics of the rifles. So right off the rip, your AK is going to be heavier than your AR. You're looking at stamped steel and rivets versus aluminum and everything's screwed together or pinned in terms of the gas block, but for the most part everything's kind of screwed together and aluminum on everything. So it's kind of going to be one thing that might come into play, especially once we start talking about magazines and loadouts and everything else. So if we're going to start from top to bottom with your AK, it's a lot easier to change out and customize your muzzle devices. There's a little pin in here that you, a detent that you press in, unscrew it. But all in all, in terms of the barrel, your barrels for AKs, if you buy something that's either a good military import or is made by a company like Kalashnikov USA or PSA, you're gonna have chrome line barrels and cold hammer forge generally. There's always outliers, but cold hammer forge and chrome line. The reason why is because the original method of building the AK required cold hammer forged barrels, and also they're all chrome line because the AK was designed to shoot lacquer coated steel ammo. To move into the ARs, your muzzle devices obviously generally just thread on, or in some cases you need to pin and weld them. And then your barrels are all sorts of different things. You can have cold hammer forge, non-cold hammer forge, different linings, all that. Some are better than others, and then you start getting into all your different gas lengths and dwell times and all that stuff. So all in all, the AR has a lot more variants that go into your barrel. And then once you start getting into muzzle devices on both, obviously you're going to have things that come into play. So we're not really going to focus on that too much, but your barrels can be any sort of combination of things, really. There's really good barrels, and then there's some that aren't as good. Once you start looking into SPRs and more performance-oriented barrels, that's when you're going to start to get into the really good stuff. But even if you honestly just get a Roscoe, it'll probably be fine. One thing to note is that you might have issues running lacquer-coated steel ammo, but lacquer-coated 5.56 or 223 is not really that common. Even steel ammo, if you get Wolf or Tula or Red Bear or whatever else, you really don't need to worry about it being lacquer-coated or corrosive. Once you start continuing down on the AK is when the AR really starts to shine. So one thing with the AK that everybody talks about, which is kind of a half-truth, is that customization is difficult. Yes and no. Your customization with your AK is, in most regards, pretty much the same as an AR if you know how to use a Dremel. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at the AK and you look at the fact that it was like a Soviet, comm block weapon, that you have Russian, Chinese, Romanian, Yugoslavian, all this stuff, you're gonna have different things and slightly different specs across the board. So with the AK, for instance, this one being a PSA, as far as I know, I could be wrong on this, but I'm almost positive that they're modeled after a 90s Arsenal spec. So Arsenal is Bulgarian, so like a 90s Arsenal, 80s or 90s Arsenal. And I'm sure somebody will know better than I am because I'm not really like a weapons historian. But where your handguards fit into the receiver is going to be slightly different than if you have a Romanian, which follows a Russian spec. Anything that you get for the most part is going to fit fine on a Romanian AK. But once you start getting into these, you're going to have to Dremel a little bit off, and you're going to have to play with stuff. Even when I got this buffer tube adapter, I had to spend quite a bit of time with the Dremel just shaving it off to get it to the point where I liked where it fit right. So for some people, they don't like that. They like it where you can slap it on and immediately go out and use it. The AKs are a little bit of a labor of love. You got to work with it a little bit. It is what it is. ARs, on the other hand, are extremely easy to customize. Everything from swapping barrels to mounting rails to everything else. For the most part, if you get a quality AR, it's going to be in the same spec. Once you start looking at AR-10s and stuff, you get a little different. But if I buy something made for the AR-15, I know that it's going to fit if I buy it from a good brand. Moving along, if I want to swap out anything in here, it's a matter of minutes and a couple of simple hand tools. That's kind of where the AR shines, is how far you really can customize it. Now the AK, anything with furniture or even the internals to a degree are still easy to customize. You can still go in, and if you want to swap out what kind of piston you have or anything like that, it's pretty simple to disassemble and do whatever you need to do. With an AR, you're looking at kind of the same thing. It's pretty easy to do, but once you start getting into gas tubes and barrels and things like that, the AR is the way to go. So if on this I decided that I wanted to switch it to a 16-inch barrel, it takes an hour, if that. If you have all the right tools and everything, 15-20 minutes at best. One thing when it comes to the accessories on the AK is that a lot of people say that dust cover mounted optics don't hold zero. If you get something like a Zenitco or a Texas Weapon Systems, they will hold zero. Will it maybe drift over thousands of rounds and hundreds or thousands of times of opening and closing the dust cover? It could, but how often do you re-zero your rifle is up to you. When you know something that it may be a failure point like that, you're probably gonna at least bore sight your rifle a little bit more. Moving up to the actual rails of the AK, this Troy one, I wouldn't rely on holding zero. The Ultimac ones, I've heard they hold zero pretty well. And then in this case, I have a Zenitco B10M rail that I've been told holds zero. Your standard AR sights are going to have, instead of this little rear notch, it's going to be an actual peephole, and then your front sight is pretty much the same. It's a post. You really don't need much more than that on a front sight. But the AR sights are better, and they're further apart, which leads to better capabilities of accuracy. Now, when we start going into the disassembly of the rifles, honestly, with the AR, this is one thing that I'm not quite fond of. And that's the fact that when you take out your bolt carrier group to clean it, because it's direct impingement, it gets dirtier on the inside where your bolt carrier group is at. There's a lot of little pieces that you can lose. In my time in the military, I've been on a handful of field ops where somebody lost a firing pin, retaining pin, and it was, at that point your weapon's inoperable. You can't use it. So with the AK, it's pretty easy to disassemble. You bring that up, take out your spring and guide rod, take out your piston, bolt, and that's it. So if you want to go into a further disassembly and take off your gas tube and everything, it's still very easy. There's not really any parts that you need to hang on to or that you can lose. And your bolt right here is pretty easy to put back in and get to the point where you can slide it back together. That's kind of one thing when you start looking at the field stripping videos of the two, is that the AK is a lot easier to field strip. And if you got to do that at night, your likelihood of losing small parts is a lot less. Granted, with the AR, you can just not take apart your bullet carrier group, but it's all gonna depend on what you're told to do or to the extent that you want to clean your rifle in the field. So one thing between these two rifles that's a large difference is piston-driven direct impingement. Yeah, you can get piston-driven ARs, but the overall majority are direct impingement. So when you start looking at the difference between the two, your AK and your piston-driven systems are going to work better in the cold and at high altitude than your direct impingement. Most of the reason why is because the air density is different in the cold than the heat, and at high altitude, obviously your air density is also going to be different. Go figure, the AK was designed in a place where it gets pretty cold. it's going to work pretty well in the cold. That's not to say that the AR will not work in the cold, but you can open yourself up to more reliability issues in the cold. I've ran ARs in the cold plenty of times and they work fine. That's kind of one of the things too with these comparisons, is that a lot of people get heated because they get emotionally invested into one platform versus the other. It's really not a, this is better than this or this is better than this. It's, these are the things that this offers and these are the things that this offers. And anything that this offers, for the most part, you're going to be able to do with this, and anything that this offers, you're going to be able to do with this. That's why we have comparisons in general. It's not a this versus that, because everybody would be using one if it was objectively better. Going from there, your direct impingement system is generally going to be a little bit more accurate. Even when you start talking about HK416s and other piston-driven ARs, your direct impingement is going to be a little bit more accurate. Is it going to make a huge difference? Probably not. Is this innately less accurate than this? Not really. We'll get into that in a little bit, but in terms of just MOA at 100 yards, honestly, they're probably pretty comparable. One thing that the piston system has going for it, and this is for MCXs and BRNs and things like that, is that your stock can fold. So once you start getting into shorter barrel configurations, having that capability of a folding stock can be very useful for transportation and concealability and everything else. There's a lot of people that build truck guns and guns specifically to go into their vehicle. And even with a 16-inch AK, your capability to fold the stock is going to make your overall length obviously much shorter, to the point to where you can take a full length 16-inch AK and fold the stock on it and fit it into places that very, very, very short ARs are only able to go when you start talking about non-folding stock options like the AR. Your piston-driven system overall is going to be a lot cleaner. And what I mean by that is that when you actually start getting into the operation of the rifle and shooting it, the trigger mechanism and everything inside of the rifle is not going to get as much carbon buildup because all of your gas exchange happens up here. With the AR, since your gas exchange, that I'm going to call it, when the gases actually operate the rifle, it happens right at the chamber. So your chamber is going to get a lot dirtier when shooting. Your trigger group is going to get a lot dirtier when shooting. And that's all stuff that over time, it can cause malfunctions. A lot of people will say that the AK is more reliable. Yes and no. There are things that make the AK innately more prone to failure, such as your safety acts as your dust cover. So when you actually operate the rifle, you take it off safe, you have this huge inlet to where dirt and debris and everything else can get. With the AR, this is a closed off system. So even if you shoot and this is all covered in dirt, the operation of it will generally get a lot of the dirt out. And even if some dirt gets into the chamber, when your bullet carrier group is going back into battery, unless you have enough dirt that will block the firing pin from hitting the primer of your bullet, or to the point where your bullet carrier group cannot go into battery into your chamber, you'll be fine. These are very reliable rifles, especially if you get good parts, especially if you take care of them. The AK is also a very reliable rifle. The thing that people will often say, and actually in an incorrect way, is that they'll mention that the AK has looser tolerances. When you're talking about machining and making things, you have clearances and you have tolerances. A tolerance is a plus or minus limit that you're able to go when manufacturing your product. A clearance is how much space you have between things that are touching. Your AK has large clearances. It does not have large tolerances. If you have large tolerances, you can't fit anything together. Even with enough Dremel work, it's gonna be very difficult to fit things together because of tolerance stacking. So when you talk about the AK, the large clearances do help with it, but it also helps affect accuracy and other things. It's always a trade-off. So we briefly talked about it before, but in terms of build durability, there's something that is going to give points to the AK and also take points away in other regions. When I had mentioned that the AK is stamped steel and rivets, it keeps it going for a lot longer. AKs also don't have to worry about things like gas rings and gas tubes blowing up or getting worn out. So, and once again, with your AR, since they are very reliable rifles, gas tubes blowing up is really only in cases of poorly made ARs, but eventually your gas tube and your gas rings will need to be replaced. On the AK, they won't. They don't exist. You don't, your gas tube is, in this case, it's a rail. So your gas tube doesn't ever need to be replaced unless you do so for customization reasons, or if you do something completely crazy to deform it to the point where your piston can't operate. So while the AK does have that in its favor, when you want to swap out a barrel, your capability to do so is going to depend on what tools you have, because these are all pressed into place. Your trunnions in the front and the rear of your receiver are pressed into place. With this, I can make this rifle 100% different and keep the receiver the same. Once you start SBRing things, that's going to really come into play, because if you SBR this lower, I can swap uppers all day. With this one, if I want to make this from a 12.5 to a 10.5 or a 14.5 or whatever, I can't necessarily do it because I don't have the equipment at home. And even if I do have the equipment, it takes quite a while. So your build durability is going to go to the AK, with the caveat that it makes things more difficult to customize. The other thing that kind of makes this take points away from the AK at the same time is that if you have a poor build quality, your barrel can walk out, your trunnions can walk out, your rivets can walk out, all these things can move on this. If something happened to the barrel, I can replace it. If something happened to the gas block where it started to move, I can put it back into place and change it out, or change how it's seated, or just reseat it and do a better job this time. Whatever the case is, any sort of issues that you start having on your AR, you generally will be able to fix, unless you do something stupid like put a 300 blackout round in it. That one you're not going to be able to fix. With the AK, if something starts to happen, you're generally going to need to take it to somebody who specializes in working on AKs. Unless you have everything to do it at home, you're kind of shit out of luck in a lot of regards. So once again, this is going to be more durable, but you can't fix things when they do happen as easily. So when you start going into the specifics of the bullet that they shoot, for the sake of time and argument for the AK, I'm just going to focus on the 7.62x39. With the AK, you can generally get them in 7.62x39, 5.56, and 5.45x39. With the AR, you can get these in a ton of different rounds: 300 blackout, 6.8 SPC. You can get ARs in 7.62x39, which are an abomination. Don't do that. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but for the time being, we're going to focus on the two main rounds that the original rifles were created with. Now, the 300 blackout for the AR is very comparable to the 7.62x39, and both of these rounds are very comparable to the 7.92 Kurtz round that the STG-44 used. So it's a very effective round, and the time that it's had to make its mark on the world, it's done a very good job. These rounds have killed a lot of people. Now, the 5.56 has also killed a lot of people. When you start getting into the actual performance of these rounds, you're going to see that there's an application to where this is a better option, and you're going to see an application where this is a better option. Once again, if there was a clear winner, this wouldn't even be a conversation, because everybody would use one of these. Now, starting with the 5.56 round, these have very good velocity. They're much better than the 7.62 for shooting at distance, because the drop is much less and the availability in the United States is very high. That is one reason why I advocate to have an AR, even if you run an AK as your primary, having an AR and a stock of 5.56 at home, because the 5.56 is very prevalent in the US. When COVID started, 5.56 was actually difficult to get, and that's when I started stocking up more on 7.62x39, because the price pretty much stayed the same. It went up a little bit, but the price of these two rounds, the 7.62x39, is still going to be cheaper, even with everything going on out east, and we're still looking at high prices for ammo. Your 7.62x39 is generally still going to be cheaper if you get steel. Granted, most AKs, if not all of them, are designed to shoot steel ammo, so it's not really a big deal. Your 7.62x39 round is slower, but because it has better mass, it generally relies on the mass versus the velocity to impact your target. When you compare both of these rounds, your 7.62 by 39 is generally going to have more foot-pounds of energy actually impacting the target up to about 300 yards. Once you get past that and the velocities start to substantially drop with these rounds, that's when this one starts to become a better performing round. 5.56, there's a lot of different rounds that you can get, everything from 55 grain to 77 grain, and I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff that I don't know about that you can also get. So whatever your use case is, you can generally find a round for that. 7.62 by 39, there are different loads that you can get for it, but generally, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, the difference is going to be whether you're looking for subsonic rounds or supersonic rounds. Now, something that people generally say with the 7.62 by 39 round is that it's an inaccurate round. It's not. The velocity on it starts to drop off fairly heavily at 300 yards. So when you start factoring in your bullet drop at range, you're going to have to take into account more bullet drop with this round since it's heavier and it's moving a little bit slower. With the AK in general, the issues with accuracy come into how they're built. If you have non-concentric barrels, you're generally going to have slanted sights, and on a lot of import rounds, the barrels are not concentric, meaning that the bore is not centered to the barrel. So that's when you can start having problems suppressing it or with your accuracy. Now, in the case of PSA, actually, since their barrels are made by a reputable company and they're made in the US under modern machining methods, your barrels are concentric. So suppressing these is going to be easier, and your accuracy with these barrels is going to be a little bit better due to the fact that the bore is centered to the barrel. Comparing the two of these, the 7.62 by 39 is generally better with shorter barrels versus the 5.56. With the 5.56, you start getting heavy velocity decreases at around 10.5 to 10.3 inches of barrel. And since your round relies so heavily on velocity, every drop in barrel length is going to result in slightly less performance. A Mark 18 that's 10.3 inches can still kill pretty effectively. So once you start getting out to range and trying to go through barriers and cover, that's when it starts to suffer a little bit. With the 7.62 by 39 round, since you have better momentum, which, once again, that's not velocity. Momentum is the actual performance of the round based on the mass and the velocity combined. Momentum might not be the right term for it, but that's what I'm going to use for this. Since you have better momentum with the 7.62 by 39, if you start decreasing barrel length, you're still going to have the ability to punch through barriers, and you're going to have better penetration at short distances. Granted, once you get out to 300 yards, that's when the 7.62 by 39 really does start to drop off, and that's when you're going to start coming up with performance issues. If you take a shot at somebody with an AK at 500 yards, you're probably still going to drop them, but you're going to have to aim a little bit higher than you would with an AR. With both of these things considered, the 5.56 round, when you start getting into heavier loads like 77 grain and purpose-built rounds for longer range, they work a little bit better for SPR builds and your longer range builds like Mark 12s and any sort of SPR that you build to shoot longer range while maintaining a pretty available and cheap round compared to 308, and to have the same round compatibility as teammates that you may have. So because your AK magazine is so much more curved, and because you have the lugs on the front and rear, you can see the rear one protrudes pretty well. The AR magazine is going to be a lot easier to fit into most pouches, especially in the US where the vast majority of things are designed for the AR magazine, and things that are purpose built for the AK magazine generally don't stack up to their AR counterparts. So the first rig that we're going to look at is the Haley Strategic Heavy Rig, and these ones obviously fit 7.60 mags pretty easily. It's designed for 308 platforms, so even with your AK magazines, there's still a bit of wobble, but you can get the Kydex retention in the Haley MP2s, and you can use the bungee retention here. So you can see I have bungee retention on these. It's going to sit a little bit taller, so when you start actually using your bungee retention, you're going to have to yank on it quite a bit more to get it on. I'm struggling to do this because I'm doing it with one hand in kind of an awkward position, but when you need to reload, you can pop it out and draw pretty easily. And then as you reinsert your rear lug, it can get caught up right here. So generally I'll put the rear lug in first and kind of twist around a little bit and let it sit. So all in all, the Haley Heavy is a pretty good rig to use. Moving on to the Haley Micro, this is also a pretty easy rig to use, but since the overall width of this is a lot less and the magazines don't have their own separate pockets to sit in, when you actually do sit your magazines in here, you have to stack them. You insert them in the reverse order that you're gonna draw them. So here's my Haley Micro, and if I were to draw it, your mags have to go in the opposite order that you sit them in. If you go to take this magazine out, it can still work, but it'll generally get caught onto this one and you can accidentally pull out 2 mags at once. But the Haley Micro also works pretty well. The Spiritus Mark IV does not. The Spiritus Mark IV is narrower. The Mark V does work if you use non-Spiritus inserts. One thing that a lot of companies have said too is that they can fit their mags, their AK mags bullets up because the locking lugs are no longer in the way. So yeah, you can do this and you don't have to worry about the actual lugs hitting each other, but then you have to worry about exposing your bullets and your followers to the dirt. So is that a good option? No. Is it potentially the only option you may have? Depending on what your equipment is. So I actually take that back. When I was trying to get this last mag out, the magazine got caught on the elastic dividers and it actually got stuck and it's pretty hard to get out. So maybe I don't even recommend putting in bullets up in general. I don't know, I never do it. Moving on to our third Haley rig in this lineup is the TRMP. The TRMP is very good for AK mags because it's designed to fit anything between 5.56 and 7.62 mags. So with these, you put your magazines in, and fits them fine. And you can fit 5.56 mags if you need to. So the consensus on a lot of these is that certain 5.56 magazine pouches will work, but not all of them will. So here's an interesting placard too, is the Shaw Concepts placard. This one was also designed to be able to fit 3 308 mags in here because it's able to expand. But the inserts that I bought with this have these Tegris dividers between them. So if I put in 5.56 mag, fits fine. And then if I put in a 7.62 AK mag, because of those Tegris retainers, it goes in fine. So I can put these in all day. I actually don't even need to put the back lug in first because they have stretch. I can just kind of put it in like I would seat a magazine normally and just kind of drive it in. So Shaw Concepts one works pretty well. This one is kind of a two-parter, is the Barrel and Hatchet Ghost with the Spiritus Thing 1. Now the Barrel and Hatchet Ghost fits 2 magazines actually. You'll notice that on these magazines, you have to stack them still. So if I want to draw these magazines, it's probably a better idea to draw the rear one because it's sitting on top. I could have it to where the front one sits on top too, but because these magazine pouches are still fairly tight with 2 7.62 AK mags in it, I can come into issues with trying to draw mags in an incorrect order. The other thing that you'll notice too is that I had to tuck the flaps. I cannot fit 2 mags into this with the flap down. Now, the flap can stretch, but because it doesn't have a Velcro interface, it has this Tegris sort of tab. Fitting that underneath and actually locking it into place is pretty difficult. So my recommendation would be to tuck your flap and then pull your elastic retainer. So when you start talking about the Thing 1 or the Thing 2 built-in pockets, they can fit 2 AK mags in them pretty well. And then you have your bungee retention that you can still use. So also things like Pry 7.62 embedder pouches, or anything that's designed to be able to take 308 mags, or even sometimes in some cases 308 mags will work. Just know that they're taller, so your bungee or flaps may not work as well. And in most cases where you have flaps, unless it's a purpose designed AK pouch, you're gonna need to use the bungees. So one thing I'm not too fond of on the AK is that you need to take it off safe to rack around into the chamber and then put it back on safe. Is it a huge deal? Probably not. There's also a lot of debate on the Eastern versus Western doctrine of loading these AKs, since they are Eastern Bloc rifles. One of the reasons why the AK charging handle was put on the right side was because guys were using bolt action rifles at the time. So using your firing hand to manipulate the rifle was more natural. With the Western doctrine of shooting, your firing hand always stays on the pistol grip. So generally when you go to load your AK, you have to seat in the front, place in the rear, and then reach around and rack around into the chamber. You can put it in and reach over top, but it's a lot more movement, and with optics in the way, it's generally a lot quicker once you put it in to rack it and then go back to work. So one thing with the AK that you'll notice is that you have to put the front in and then rock it. There's a lot of times where if you don't have the front seated in, you can try to put the magazine in and it doesn't seat properly to where the rear will seat, but your front won't. Another thing too is that unless you're able to somehow push this finger forward and eject the magazine like that, it's not a one-handed operation. You have to actually reach up. Generally what I'll do when I need to reload my AK when I'm out of ammo is I'll come up with my new magazine, knock out the old one with my thumb, seat the new one, and rack around into it, and then go back to shooting. The other thing with the AK is that manipulating the safety was designed to be able to do with heavy gloves. It's all very large movements to do everything. There's no fine little buttons or anything like that. The actual reload of the AK does take a little bit longer to do, and it takes a lot longer to get very proficient at. Guys that are really fast at reloading AK spend a lot of time working at it. When you start talking about the AR, you start talking about a rifle that's a lot easier to use right off the bat. Now you have a lot more things to manipulate. You have your safety from your thumb, your magazine release, your bolt release. But inserting a magazine, you take it, you put it in. That's it. And then from there, you would load around. Generally, the only way that you can have issues with seating your magazine is if you don't seat it all the way. The best way to mitigate that is when you put your magazine in, give it a quick tug to make sure that it is fully seated. With the AR, since your bolt locks to the rear, when you need to reload it, it's easy to drop the old magazine, put the new one in, and then just reach your thumb right up and hit that bolt release. There's no weird movements that you need to do. You don't need to crank the rifle in one way or the other or do anything like that. It's pretty cut and dry. So that largely sums up the comparison of these two rifles and everything that kind of goes with it. At the end of the day, whatever you train with more, you should use. If you're thinking about getting an AK for the sake of having an AK, I don't see why not. When you start going into the cost of the two rifles, these are pretty comparatively priced, but right off the rip, getting a base rifle, getting an AR in the US is gonna be a lot cheaper. So getting anything with an AK is probably gonna be more expensive. So to sum up the comparison between the AR and the AK, if you're in the US, you should own an AR at the very least. You should get an AR, put a good optic, light, and sling on it, and if you wanna have that collect dust in the corner while you have some rounds stored away and some mags and you just run your AK all the time, that's fine. It's also gonna come up to your individual or your group SOPs, or if you're in the military, obviously you're not gonna be using an AK unless you just play out for all day. But I would say that even in the US, if you have an AK and if you run your AK as your main rifle, to have an AR to go with it. Just because of how prevalent the AR is, how prevalent parts are, and having a backup rifle. And the benefit of having two different rounds is that if one of them becomes unavailable because of a cough, then you can still get another round potentially. If you have any more questions or anything like that on the comparison of these two rifles, feel free to message us at the Longhouse Preparedness or comment below.